Welcome to Biotensegrity Party number 11, the Fuss Over Fascia. Now we've got Carol M. Davis today, who's going to sort of moderate a roundtable discussion with Joanne Avison and John Sharkey and David Lesondak on the subject of the fascia. Before that, we have got a little special treat from Steve, his presentation called The Fuss Over Fascia. And before that, I have a little surprise. Graham, why don't you tell us about our sponsors?
Okay, thank you, Susan. Our Biotensegrity Tea Party is made possible in part through support from Handspring Publishing in East Lothian, Scotland, producers of highly accessible and easily applied research-based material for movement and manual therapy professionals. The amazing team at Handspring see publishing as an art as well as a science, and for them, it is a human and intellectual enterprise as well as a business. The Biotensegrity Tea Party is also sponsored by ArteFact Pro of Madrid, Spain, where you can find beautiful and wonderfully constructed tensegrity models, including models of the spine and pelvis. We are also generously supported by Chris Clancy's educational organisation, Embodied Biotensegrity, in Vancouver, British Columbia. And for those of you looking to learn more about biotensegrity, then Chris's programs are an excellent resource, including right now a free 28-day trial and the pay-as-you-can Shifting Paradigms course in biotensegrity. And each of our sponsors are offering a generous discount, which you can find out more about by registering for the Biotensegrity Tea Party newsletter on the Stephen Levin Biotensegrity archive. And I think it's over to you now, Susan.
Okay, great. So for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, this is Biotensegrity Party number 11, the Fuss Over Fascia. We have guests Steve Levin, Carol Davis, David Lesondak, Joanne Avison, and John Sharkey. And before we start, I have breaking news. So let's see if I can do it. Tell me if you're seeing it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Take a look at this. This came out Wednesday from Nature.
Holy
Revolutionary Microscopy. Do you see it, or should I do? Are you seeing full screen? There.
Yes.
That's better.
Oh, that's it.
Revolutionary microscopy technique sees individual atoms for first time. It opens up a whole new universe. This is cryo-electron microscopy of the protein apoferritin. Now take a very close look. Do we not see hexagons, triangles, systems within systems?
Microtubules.
I mean, is this incredible? Does this not bear out what we've been studying? So I just wanted to share that. It just came out on June 3rd. I just looked at it and I just nearly fell on the floor. Let's
wow.
see.
Whoa.
That's
Yeah.
a validation of my theory. How do you like that?
Isn't that?
Steve?
That's how I saw it. So I'm going to stop my share.
Microhedrons instead of a bunch of flowers.
It's a little of everything.
All those microtubules, all that energy flow in there.
Isn't that gorgeous?
Yes.
I'm going to pass it over to Carol for the toast.
Okay, everybody from all over the world, good friends of mine, good friends of all of ours, thank you for joining us today. This is my cup from Ireland in honor of John Sharkey and all my friends coming in from Ireland today, part of my heritage. But let's lift our glasses or our cups or our whatever we have in honor today, especially of Steve Levin, the father of all of this that we're talking about today. It's so good to have him here with his video and for all of us to be talking generation after generation, well, one generation maybe, maybe 2. And it will go on beyond us, way beyond us. So lift our glasses to the evolution of this wonderful theory. Thank you, Stephen Levin.
Chin chin.
Cheers. Thanks, Carol.
Okay, and Graham, I think you're going to intro Steve's presentation, yes?
Yes, okay. I think most people will know of Steve Levin. For those who don't, he's the pioneer of biotensegrity, worked tirelessly to promote the concept and investigate it, and he's still going strong with new ideas coming out regularly. He trained and practiced as an orthopedic surgeon, and also went into manual therapy techniques which didn't require surgery but got very good results as well. So I think I'll pass it over to you, Steve, as a short presentation which to start the whole thing off.
Thank you very much, Graham, and all. And it really is nice to have 40 some odd years of work validated in a little picture like that today. Thank you very much, Susan, for that. I'm going to do, I've decided I'd try my luck at movies, and this is my second movie, and I've gotten it down to 11 minutes. I can't believe that. That's the shortest presentation I've ever done. And as usual, it's an attempt at being a little iconoclastic, and I'm just going to run it for you and run you through the 11 minutes. In the past several years, there has been an explosion of interest in fascia, but for more than a century, many have been aware of its significance. It has not been ignored or overlooked. First, let's define what we are talking about. The body is a construct of cells. Its parenchyma is a functional tissue of an organ as distinguished from the connective and supporting tissue. Parenchyma, with its connective and supporting tissue, the fascia, construct an organ and then an organism. I first understood the importance of fascia as a budding surgeon some 60 years ago when I learned that surgeons sew fascia, not parenchyma, as parenchyma is structureless on its own. In the 1980s and 90s, I was involved with these people, and they were elbow deep in fascia. Phil Greenman from Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine, Tony Chila from Ohio University College of Osteopathic Medicine, Paul Kimberly, Professor of Anatomy at Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine, Bob Ward, Professor at MSU, and an assortment of hangers-on like John Manel, Janet Travell, Vladimir Yanda, and a few others. Evidently, I gleaned enough from them that they let me into their club, and I taught alongside them at Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine for many years. Osteopathic medicine was founded by A.T. Still, who said things like, fascia is a continuous envelope that extends from head to toe, front to back, surrounding every organ, every blood vessel, every nerve, every bone, every muscle. Fascia is the fabric of an organism, and the parenchyma is embroidered within it. So if we look at an organ like a muscle, and a muscle is an organ, muscle is a condensation of muscle parenchyma woven into the fascial fabric. It is spandex of the fascial fabric. Well, where does the fascia begin? We have to start somewhere, and of course it starts at the cell. Cells connect to each other into the extracellular matrix, the fascia, through the integrin connections, so that the cells are physically connected to each other and to the extracellular matrix. But I don't think we should ignore the fact that there's an intracellular matrix connecting the organelles within the cells, and that the intracellular matrix connects to the extracellular matrix by integrins. So there's a connection from the cell nucleus right to the skin. These connections seem helter-skelter. You are all familiar with the dance of the subcutaneous fascia, so beautifully demonstrated in Gimbarto's films. They appear to be random movements, but they are not. They conform to strict mathematical rules called Voronoi patterns, and this stance is choreographed by the second law of thermodynamics. We believe that the three-dimensional organization of the fascia fabric is a multi-nested tensegrity with its dynamics related to Delaunay patterns, the first cousin to Voronoi patterns. Well, what are little boys made of? Collagen snot, which may appear clear, formless, and absent of any structure, but desiccated and it transmutes into structured matter that is tough as shoe leather. In fact, it is shoe leather. Collagen is readily transmutable, changing from a fluid to gel to semi-solid to tough and leathery. Building anything, including organisms, requires architecture and the necessary materials to construct it with. For us, the architecture is tensegrity. In the material world, we are taught that there are three forms of matter: solid, liquid, and gas, each having its distinctive associated mechanical laws, and we're stuck with them. But biologic matter is none of these. Biology is soft matter and comes with its own set of laws. Forget about gas, solids, and liquids and their associated laws. They are not part of the internal workings of an organism. Soft matter is the physics of gels, emulsions, liquid crystals, and biological matter. The display that you are staring at on your computer screen is a liquid crystal display, and things can change in your body as quickly as do the images on your screen. Soft matter is about slime and superballs, and the capability of flipping from one state to the other instantaneously. And contrary to some recent writings, there are no free liquids in the body. Starting with embryologic mesenchymal cells, the organism builds different fascial tissues depending on first the in utero and then the extra utero stresses. The tissues are self-organizing, have emergent properties, and are transmutable, and this includes all tissues of the locomotor system: ligaments, tendons, muscles, and bone. Decalcify bone, and you have a fascial net. Within that net are the osteocytes and their connecting fascia. We therefore have parenchyma and an extracellular matrix. Put them together and you have an organ. Now coat them with hydroxyapatite crystals, which you can now recognize as icosahedrons, and voila, ossified bone. So bone then is a specialized condensation of parenchyma within the fascia, coated with hydroxyapatite crystals. Essentially a starch fascia. So you can start with DNA, work into the intracellular matrix, then into a fascial continuum that engulfs the whole organism, and work your way in a circular pattern. Everything is connected to everything. The new in thing, that fascia is a sensory organ, is really an old new thing, as A.T. Still described fascia as a sensory organ over 100 years ago. As Still wrote in 1899, all nerves go to and terminate in that great system, the fascia. But I would add that it's more than just the nerves ending in the fascia. Fascia is a great communicator, and it does so by several means. By physical connection of cell to cell and cell to extracellular matrix, information is physically transferred through the entire fascial system. It does this by talking to each of its neighbors and small world networking, the way schools of fish, flocks of birds, and even your computer communicate. The central nervous system may be left out of the discussion, at least in the early stages. Some of the communication may be quite local, as shown here in the tendons, or more accurately, the muscles of the fingers, showing that they talk to each other without having to bother with the slow and cumbersome central nervous system. And now we come to one of my favorites, oscillators. Tight strings, springs, and tensegrities are oscillators. And oscillations create phase change, sound, electromagnetic forces, heat, energy transfer, pressure, and information. The cells feel, see, hear, smell, and taste each other. If there is any division in the system, it would be between the visceral fascia and what Van der Waal calls posture and locomotor system. If you take the fascia that's concerned with posture and movement and combine them with their contiguous organs of muscle and bone, you get Van der Waal's posture and locomotor system and what Graham and I have called the mesokinetic organ. Let's go back to an earlier slide, the one that defined an organ. Now let's remove the parenchymal cells, and what are we left with? It is here where my cloth analogy unravels. We are left with the fascial net, but that is really an illusion. You may recall this earlier slide where fascial tissues arose from undifferentiated mesenchymal cells. It is the cells that create the fascia, not the fascia creating the cells. Fascia without its parenchyma would be like a spider web without its spider. I am a Jew, and like Shakespeare's Jew who could not separate flesh and blood, I cannot separate fascia from its muscle and bone. The parenchyma and its fascia are an inseparable unit. There is no separate fascia. Functionally, it is an integral part of an organ and only exists as part of its organ. That would make any therapy solely directed to the treatment of fascial malfunction a bit of wishful thinking. I'll leave you with this final quote from Andrew Taylor Still. Fascial continuity, its nervous system investments, and vascular relationships clearly demonstrate how all parts work together. The human body is a unity of function. So why the fuss over fascia?
Ezekiel saw the wheel.
He saw that wheel way in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel.
Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa.
In the middle of the air. Saw the wheel. He saw that wheel way in the middle.
Okay, so back to our show. Today we've got Carol Davis with us, and here's my problem. I just think of her as this wonderful person that I got to meet through Biotensegrity, and I forget about her amazing, credentials. But she's got some impressive ones, and I'll just give you one or two. So she's a myofascial release physical therapist, and she's Professor Emerita, do we say? At Department of Physical Therapy, Emerita, thank you, Emerita. I think I'm discombobulated again. Anyway, at Department of Physical Therapy, University of Miami, Miller School of Medicine. Her book, Integrative Therapies and Rehabilitation, is in its 4th edition. Her book, Patient-Practitioner Interaction, is in its 6th edition. She's been working with the biotensegrity paradigm through her training with John Barnes for decades. So welcome, Carol.
Thank you.
And we also have for our roundtable, Joanne Sarah Avison. I don't see you, Joanne, but I think I don't have, I'm in gallery view, but I know she's here. Joanne has an amazing background from, structural integration person, yoga teacher. Her book from Handspring is Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy, and Movement. And you can just watch Biotensegrity Party number 5, and you'll hear more about that. And Carol's holding it up. Thanks, Carol. My first exchanges with Joanne were in 2012. And after we had formed DC Big, we would watch her do the Fascia Talk Show. So it's great. She's been also working with this concept for a long time. David Lesondak is author of Fascia, What It Is and Why It Matters. And I'm sure somebody's got that to hold up. It's got a gorgeous cover. And thanks, Graham, there it is. That's a Michael Gard sculpture, G-A-R-D. Look up that guy, it's wonderful stuff. David's a structural integrator and fascia specialist at the Center for Integrative Medicine, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. His next book, he's editor-in-chief of Fascia, Function, and Medical Applications, and that's coming in September from Rutledge. He's produced over 100 educational videos for Fascia Research Congress and others, and we got to hear his FM radio voice earlier. So maybe we'll get treated to a little of that today. And then last but not least, John Sharkey is clinical anatomist, exercise physiologist, co-author of the Concise Book of Muscles. Let me just say, everybody has too many amazing credentials to tell you about all of them. So John's been assisting Robert Schleip and Carlos Stecco with the Fascia Research Society's Plastination Project. He's got a 5-day dissection with Carlos Stecco in the US coming up in, I believe, November. He was kind enough to co-host our Tea Party number 9 when we did Jan Trewartha and Sharon Wheeler's Adhesion Scars and the Biotensegrital Body book. So you can look that up. And he's a contributor to that book as well. So again, very incomplete introductions to people that you probably already know. But I'm going to say, take it away, Carol.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everybody. So nice to be here. Joanne, David, John, good to see you. Good to have you here with me, always. Steve, that was a wonderful video. It was packed full. Of course, I want to watch it about 15 times. And I think that you made a point that you've been talking about tangentially for a while, and I'd like to start with the panel this way. I have questions for each one of you individually, and I have questions for everybody to respond to. But I'd like to start based on what Steve presented to us. And Steve's, if there's one basic point about what Steve had to offer this time, is, for me, it's that everything is connected to everything. And I don't think that there would be anybody who would challenge that. So I'd like you to be thinking about that. Mei-Wan Ho has this, the marvelous biophysicist who left us too early. She said this: how do we account for the unitary nature of a living organism, the way it responds as a whole to any stimulus, as if every part of it knew what every other part is doing? Or how is it that an organism behaves as a whole and not as a collection of parts, like a machine? And I'd like to include in that question the relationship between fascia and biotensegrity and how they go together to enlighten your responses to that kind of question. How is it that everything is connected to everything, and fascia and biotensegrity are pathways to better understanding that? And I'll let you decide who wants to start. But John, David, Joanne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great to be here. I'll answer by saying very simply that you grew yourself. And the fact that you grew yourself means that you are one. Everything is one. And as I often say, I love to talk about spectrums. And what you get is you get speciality along the spectrum. And the spectrum you can use color, or you can use something like stiffness versus hardness, or softness versus hardness. If it was muscle fibers that we were talking about, we might talk about at one end of the spectrum being red, the other end of the spectrum being kind of silvery white. And then what color do you get in between? As I say, in relation to all of this stuff, a lot of people mistake this, because it's hard, for being hard matter, where in fact all it is just harder soft matter. So on that spectrum, you get a spectrum of hardness to softness. But the easiest way, and this is not dumbing it down, it's just making it a little more simplistic, is simply saying you grew yourself. So everything is connected to everything else.
Joanne, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, for me, that connectivity for everything connected to everything else, we have to interpret that to make sense of that and apply that in movement or manual therapy. The big thing for me about the connectivity that Steve talks about, the idea that it's a spectrum of softness to hardness, and this is my thing that I say, is that everything we form ourselves in, we begin as, we continue as, is in the round. And that makes us what I call 361 degrees. And the reason I say that is that the symbol of one is the monad. And the word monad, it's an alphanumeric language, Greek. The word monad adds up to 361. And in alphanumeric languages, an allowance of one, and it's a very symbolic allowance, is always made because the one and the all are the same. And that brings me to that roundness having multi-dimensional characteristics, because of course, in the living body, we are not just restricted to the network of connectivity in the physical, we are animating that network of connectivity and we are aware of it. And as you know, I'm trained in a mystery school and working with yoga. We work with yantras, mantras, and the movements, and they're all engaged in the geometry. And what, for me, why biotensegrity is such a keystone of understanding fascia is because it brings the geometry of that connectivity to life. And we can't reduce this to geometry. We don't cut this open and pull out tensegrity icosahedrons. We have to step into a larger dimension, one that we occupy anyway, and we have to expand into that to be able to understand how the geometry of form and forces through this form actually takes place. And it takes something to do that. However, if you come from this idea that the one and the all are the same, and you remember that you're working in 361 degrees of wholeness all the time, whether you're looking down from the cosmos or up from here at the cosmos, or down a microscope to the microcosmos, or through the telescope to the cosmos and beyond the cosmos, it's all the same, or same but different, as they say in Asia. So yeah, what makes us all exactly the same is that every single one of us is unique. And so welcome to our unique being unit, unicity, one. So I hope that endorses what John just said and expands.
Sure.
David.
Yeah, to that, I would just add, without the one, there is no 360. So it has to be 361. If we get back to what I think the central question you said, Carol, is what is the relationship between fascia and biotensegrity? Because some people can still be a little fuzzy about that. Without fascia, there is no biotensegrity. Again, as Einstein said, make things simple, but don't make them too simple. So when I'm talking to my patients sometimes, I just kind of explain that you've got about 212 or so moving parts connected about 1,647 ways. It's exactly that simple and exactly that complicated. So it's an understanding. So biotensegrity is the model for us humans, but it's kind of like saying, well, what are the subway tunnels in New York City? Well, you just like, what is their relationship to the city? Well, it's what connects everything else in the city to itself. But you need the cars in the tunnels, you need the city, and you need the tunnels to make it all a whole model of New York City and that transportation. Just as you cannot separate fascia from biotensegrity. Biotensegrity is the model. Fascia is the prime component of that biotensegrity.
And you make a very good case in your text, I think, about the role integrins play in that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. They are the binders of the force that actually stick everything together. And I love, and Stephen, I took a screenshot of it. So, because when you see a good thing, steal it. I love that illustration you had with the cells and the integrins attaching the cells to each other. I've never seen that illustration before. Thank you for that.
Right. that's really also the foundation, I think, of Susan Lowell de Solano's book that I've had the pleasure of reading. So we can look forward to what Susan has to say about that in terms of the arts. But let's move on a little bit here. And David, I'd like to ask you, what motivated you to write your book, your little book, which is a huge little book, fascia, what it is and why it matters. It's now translated into how many languages? 7 or 8?
Nine.
9?
9 languages.
And it's just jam-packed. I mean, every page is just full of wonderful information. There's no fluff in here. The illustrations are phenomenal. How did you get so much material in such a succinct little book? What went into that?
First of all, thank you. It's always nice to hear good things about your work. Very often people like to point out what what you got wrong. So really, thank you. That is never gets old. Couple of things. One was spending years going to not just the fascia research congresses, but also being able to work behind the scenes at the fascia summer schools in Germany and videotaping all these scientific presentations. The other is my position at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where, we're doing a thing. Do you want to give a lecture? Sure. Oh, we need somebody to do something on the right way to sit. Oh, okay. Let's do, sitting 101 in biotensegrity for the library department at the medical library. So I'm spending years trying to take that and explain it, not just to people that I treat with manual therapy, but in the bigger picture of the medicine world, and trying to distill these concepts and these ideas down to something explainable and relevant. So I've been practicing a long time before I ever put digital pen to digital paper to create that. But the answer to the other question was, it was needed. There wasn't a book like this out there. And I always go back to what my partner of 26 years, tomorrow's our anniversary, Coletta Perry, said, if you're going to write a book about fascia, you better say what it is and why it matters. And I went, okay, that's the working title for the book. And as you see, we never changed it. I had the opportunity to, I don't want to say work with, some amazing doctors in physical medicine and rehab, and they're kind of a breed of their own. They're quasi-osteopaths themselves, or as one calls himself, a fasciopath. But the other ones, the ones that you think I would be able to harmonize well with in sports medicine, yada, 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 they'd say, I don't get this fascia stuff. And I would throw them Fascia, the Tensional Network of the Human Body, or Carla Stecco's Atlas. And I'd get, why does everybody write about Dupuytren's? I see none of that. They didn't get the relevance. So I was realizing that not only from the clinical level, but also from the medical level, there had to be a way to simplify it. And honestly, Carol, the thing that took the longest, I don't want to say it was the hardest, but the thing that took the longest in putting the book together was coming up with the outline. Because the challenge in talking about or writing about fascia is that if it was a superpower, it can go everywhere and it can almost maybe do everything. So how do you keep moving forward without going off on a bunch of tangents and kind of forgetting where you came from? So once I had that outline down of chapter by chapter by chapter, so that it reads more like a novel, as opposed to a book where my next book, which is more of a medical textbook, where people will probably jump around to read the relevant chapter they want to read first, and that's fine. But I wanted something that would give you a beginning, a middle, and an end, and would build on itself as you went through it.
And it does beautifully.
Thank you. So that's
tell people this is what I read before I go to sleep at night.
Okay, so did it ever influence your dreams? That's my question for you.
Oh, I'm sure it did, but I can't tell you that.
You can't remember them. Okay. So that's kind of how it came to be. And I had honestly been thinking for years, there needs to be a book like this out there. I think I could write it. So my blog for a couple of years was kind of my practice sessions at writing to that audience. And it just kind of organically during a conversation with Handspring, we were talking about just that very thing. And one thing led to another. And the next thing you know, they're saying, okay, we want it in 1 year. And it came in, I got to tell you this, it came in about 8,000 words short. I had the number wrong in my head. And they said, it's a bit short. And I said, well, how about if we put a glossary of terms at the end? That should about cover half of that shortness. And they said, okay. And we compromised at that point. So
the succinctness is one of
them. Yes, succinctness was important. It's good to know when to stop. And I think I should stop this answer and we should move on.
Joanne, how about you? You have a marvelous book. You did some of the illustrations. A lot of the illustrations in here, Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy, and Movement. It's a beautiful book, and it goes to the arts. It goes to all different kinds of, and the illustrations are just beautiful. Talk to us about your adventure in writing your book.
Well, I got a whole tea party, so I feel I shouldn't say very much. But basically, I was originally trained in yoga. Well, I was originally a chocolatier, which is actually really key. I now know, but didn't then. And I became a yoga teacher, and then I studied, now I'm a yoga therapist as well, and integrating that with structural integration. And I met Tom Myers in '98 and started training with him, and I traveled to Maine, in fact, where I met David, I think must be about 20 years ago now. And actually at the time, Anatomy Trains was absolutely brand new. I read the first proofs of Anatomy Trains. Tom, I was an author then anyway. I came to the work as an author. Previously, I was a resident author at Cassell's. And so Tom asked me to proofread the original copy. So I kind of, if I say I cut my anatomical teeth on it, Tom walked into our studio in Brighton in 1998 and said, there ain't no muscle connected to no bone, nowhere in no body. And it was quite a like, oh my God, what is this? And we spent several years. I did the first Anatomy Trains dissection with Tom. I think David was there as well. And in fact, some of the photographs from that dissection are in his book. And what was happening at that time was that Anatomy Trains had made this massive step forward. I always say Tom cleared a clearing in the forest for those of us who, lots of people now stand there saying, no, Tom, you're wrong. That's not a beech tree, it's an oak tree. But Tom cleared that clearing. He really did. He walked the boards and he made it possible for us all to move into an anatomy of connectivity. Now, Steve Levin is saying quite rightly, as the research, because there's quite a lot of research in my book showing the story of the history of the fascia, and how the history of our culture and learning anatomy and learning medicine and learning art, and God knows they made me cut the history chapter by half, Carol. I mean, you can imagine I had Shakespeare in there and Leonardo and everybody, and they just so I had to keep it a bit more focused. But what you discover in that history chapter, and what I discovered in working to write it, was the number of things that influenced fascia being left out of the equation. And it wasn't that the fascia wasn't there. It was that the significance of bringing it into how we explained things wasn't there. And I personally think it's been hidden in the obvious, because, we haven't designed fascia. We haven't come up with fascia. We wouldn't, like as Steve says, what's all the fuss? It was always there. It precedes us. But what was so exciting for me was to realize that it was so everywhere, so ubiquitous, so taken for granted because we were cutting through it to see the other things, that it was hidden in the obvious, and it literally got lost in translation. It wasn't that anyone says it wasn't there. Any anatomist will tell you this is fascia, this is fascia, this is fascia. But what hadn't been recognized in this paradigm that we're in now is the significance of it. And various changes in the world, and I started facilitating Robert Schleip's workshops here, and Robert and I were in a conversation. I mean, we worked together for several years, and Robert was saying, how do we bring this to movement? We're getting it into manual therapy now through the Rolf Institute, and because Ida Rolf talked about fascia all the time. I mean, like, her name hasn't been mentioned here, but hello. And she was doing massive amounts of work orienting the balance of what we call psychology with physiology. And for her, they were non-separable. And in yoga, Khalsa has done his work where he is a very important figure in the yoga world and at Harvard Medical School, bringing psychology and physiology together. And all these protagonists upon whose shoulders we stand have been in this conversation, trying to make sense of it in movement, trying to make sense of it in manual therapy, trying to bring it out without it having the, how can I say, the priority in medical training, because fascia is discussed usually as a discrete piece, the lumbosacral fascia or the thoracolumbar fascia or the, you know, whatever. But it's, or we know that the fascia, the eardrum is this delicate fascia. But what I think has happened since Robert pretty much got the article he got into Science magazine, or it might have been Nature, I can't remember, I think it was Science, that instigated the first research congress in 2007, was this recognition of its significance as playing a role in everything. Now, for me, my job, if you like, or the job Robert gave me, I was, you know, the Handspring commissioned me to write that book, and I was terrified. I have to say, Serena came down to Brighton and she just picked up my hands, you know, hands in my wrists, and she went, "But you work with these." I don't have nails usually, this is lockdown. She's like, "You work with these hands, what are you?" And because I'd got the manual and the movement therapy and the anatomy, she asked me to write a book for yoga teachers about movement. And I didn't really want to write about yoga, because within the yoga world, there's so many factions and different types of yoga. And for me, the idea of factions and bodies, I mean, everything that's going on in the world right now, I just thought it's an anathema to me. You know, I recognize my book's an achievement. I'm so grateful. However, it's a responsibility. And what I started was pioneering a quest, and I so haven't finished, to find out the holistic view. Mae Won Ho is one of my idols. Thank you for mentioning her. Her work about the fluid matrix and so on. And what I didn't know, and thank you Leonid Blyum for pointing it out to me, I didn't realize, was that 20 years as a chocolatier meant I had myself elbow deep in working with the emergent properties of a liquid crystal matrix. Mm-hmm. So now that's going to inform my next edition, because Steve, it's what Steve did in that piece where he said that the hard matter, or the three phases that we know, solid, liquid, gas, yeah, is solid and liquid bulk. It's bulk liquid, it's free mm-hmm. liquid. Mm-hmm. And I happened to, one time I had a partner who was in trees, and in trees they know there's free water and bound water. They know all about bound water, there's no question. Yeah,
John, can I shift to you for a second now? John, tell me something. At the Fascia Research Congress, at one point you said, "Biotensegrity teaches me about how to be a good person, a better man, a better father." How could the architecture idea of biotensegrity morph into a core value for you?
Okay, well, before I answer that, I want to make sure that I answer it briefly, because I want to get back to David. I want you to direct more questions to him. I want to hear him talking and maybe others talking. I think people have had a lot of me over the last number of years, but that's okay. I love that question, Carl, and thanks for asking it, because, you know, biotensegrity for me informs every single thing that I do. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, biotensegrity is the language of the human body. I'm constantly saying this, that from a simplistic viewpoint, biotensegrity talks of tensions and compressions. And that language can therefore change depending on who it is that you're talking about. But there are tensions and compressions in personal relationships. So biotensegrity takes me from the inner aspect of who I am, and also helps to explain the outer aspects, which seem somewhat disconnected from you. I mean, a very simple thing I get people to do is to wave your hand like this, and you feel something against your hand. But yet when you look into this room, you would think that this room was mostly empty. And of course, this room is not empty. There is something that is touching your skin. And therefore, if there was another person in this room with me, it's also touching their skin. It's a connection between me and them. And so for me, biotensegrity helps me to explain where I fit in, you know, in the great scheme of things on the earth, and where we fit then within the overall cosmos. It brings a certain value to my life, because they're the big questions. People want to know, why am I here? Why was I born? What's the point of it? I mean, Joanne knows that we were talking yesterday. I lost a very close friend of ours. She got married in 2018, a beautiful wedding ceremony in Thailand. And the next morning she woke up to her husband, Frank, and said, I don't feel well. And she had a brain cancer. And two years later, she's passed. She passed yesterday. What a beautiful human being. Yeah, we have one bite of the cherry in my world. I don't want to infringe on anybody else's belief systems, but it helps me and informs me to understand that I don't need to have some overarching male white figure with a beard waving his finger to say, if you don't behave, Mr. Sharkey, you're going to be in trouble. I think that we intrinsically know right from wrong. As I say, I don't need to have this threat that if I do something wrong, that I'm going to have a price to pay for eternity. I don't believe that at all. And biotensegrity informs me in that regard. Now, by the way, everybody can interpret it in their own particular way. And if I had a longer period of time to speak, perhaps maybe 4 days, I might be able to make better sense of that. But the easiest thing for me to say is that biotensegrity, as I say, for me, explains everything. I mean, literally, it answers everything, even down to the Big Bang, or if you want to make the analogy between the Big Bang and embryology. And then, what happened before the Big Bang and what was there before the Big Bang, because cosmologists will say, well, everything came from nothing, but then they'll explain what nothing is and the cosmic foam. And it still comes down to, either electromagnetic or nuclear reactions. And they are, repulsion versus attraction. But to me, that's tension versus compression. And that's what I hope that's a good enough answer for you, Carl.
No, that's great. Because when Graham said that, I can't remember when he said it to me, but or all of us, it just all clicked. Of course, from the basic anatomy, from the basic groundwork of everything that is, it's the attraction and repulsion of the atom, the electron and the proton. Constantly the force and the compression and the traction, compression and pull away, at the very basis of all of life. Then it comes up that these models that we build are just some sort of framework where we can kind of envision the fact that the structure of this framework that Susan showed us, that beautiful picture of those cells, those tubules form these structures because of all of the principles of biotensegrity that Graham brings out beautifully in his book, by the way. And I'm realizing it's 2:05. Do I have to stop here being a good host, Chris or Susan?
Take an hour, Carol. Sorry? You were supposed to. You didn't start till later, and you were supposed to take an hour. Take it to the hour. Is what they do.
Yes, we'll do a station. Go ahead, Graham.
No, I was going to say I'm going to just drop in here from. I remember one of my patients many years ago.
Wait, hold on, John, because we've got this kind of logistics thing going on. We're breaking up the fascia discussion for just a sec. Graham, you were going to say?
I'll just pop in there to say that I disagree with what you're saying, John, but I think this discussion is not for this meeting. I don't agree with everything you say there, and I think it's important that we discuss it sometime.
No problem. Well, I can remember once one of my patients coming into me, and she was coming to me. She had headaches, and it was a little bit of a joke. But I basically said to her, "And can you, what do you think brings on the headaches? Or is there any particular thing that brings on the headache?" And she said, "Well, what happens basically is," she says, "my husband opens his mouth, and his voice then," she says, "comes into my ears." And she said, and suddenly I feel that, and I really felt that it was the tension between the two of them that was keeping them together. I was a little bit worried that if I was to actually, if I could, not that I could necessarily, but if I could do something to intervene that would take away her headaches, that I might actually destroy the relationship between the two of them. Now, this is going back many, many years. And so really the tension compression relationship there for me is also a reflection of the relationships of the individuals. So it has to be put into perspective, and I don't think you do justice to it, in just a couple of minutes. I think
what we can do is just plan a whole tea party around this kind of discussion. But Susan, please, can I?
So Carol, I think why don't we stop for a little station identification at about 2:15, because
all
we
right.
got started late. And so
Okay.
we can let the conversation go on a few more minutes, and then
All right.
we'll transition at that point. And I know somebody's been keeping track of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, good.
So we'll maybe have some of those as well. So
Wonderful.
thank you everyone for your attention.
Yeah, thanks for your attention. David, let's get back to you now. How has this understanding of this dynamic of biotensegrity that we've been talking about changed your practice? Or informed your practice?
Yeah, changed is the wrong word. I kind of like John said, other things began to make sense. So I was introduced to tensegrity and biotensegrity, I want to say in 2002, 2003. And prior to that, I had been working as a self-styled clinical massage therapist. But in my trigger point training, I didn't use the conventional Travell-Simons charts. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Janet Travell and Peter David Simons, they wrote two really thick books on myofascial trigger points. And here's the trigger point and where it's located, and here's the referral zone. I had these charts that were color-coded because there was, somebody had mapped out that if you have a trigger point here, you might also have a trigger point there, and you might have a trigger point over there. And so there were two charts, and there was 4, 5, 6 different colors. And so they were sort of mapped, and along with, you know, just doing some of the basic good deep relaxation things, I just became a very good hunter or detective, if you might say, and looking at those charts and going, okay, oh yeah, they do have one there. Okay, yeah, oh, they have one there too. And after all, I didn't even need the charts. So, you know, this idea that it's all connected was there from the earliest stages. Actually, Deepak Chopra's book, Quantum Healing, which seems rather quaint by today's standards, was a huge influence on me, but we're talking like 1992.
Yes, I used it in my classes. My students thought I was crazy. Go ahead.
So that's great. I found it. I wasn't even working professionally yet with a professional address. I was making house calls as needed, and I was on my way like 40 miles, so that would be like 80 kilometers away, to go to somebody's house to do a treatment, because this was my vocation. And I stopped. I was like, I left way early because of traffic, and I'm like, I got an hour to kill. Oh, there's a used bookstore, and that's where I found Quantum Healing. So anyway, enough old war stories. So the tensegrity concept, and, you know, leveraging it through Tom Meyer's Clearing the Forest for here's some maps of how it potentially connects, was like, boom, okay, yeah, this was exactly what I had been looking for. And we have a name for it now. And it was so inherently obvious to me. And simultaneously, I was exposed to seeing the face, not the name, Donald Ingber and his work on biotensegrity in the cell. And then I think the following summer in Maine, I met Stephen. He came up to kind of hang out with us and do some lectures there in Tom's little enclave there in Maine. So it gave a framework to something that I was already working with that was inherently as sensible and orderly as you can be when you're talking about something as complex as the human organism.
Wonderful. Great. Well, we have about 5 more minutes, and I'd like to just open this up to everybody. The riddle within Heraclitus's doctrine of universal flux is that while everything is constantly changing, everything remains the same. How does biotensegrity give us insight into, well, everything is constantly changing, everything remains the same? And I think this is the foundation of what I have come to know as homeodynamics from Joanne Avison's view. How does everything constantly changing remain the same? And how is that so much a part of our evolution as human beings?
Well, I'm just gonna pop right in here, because some of our other guests have alighted on the events going around the world right now, particularly in the country where I live. And I just want to say, let's hope they don't stay the same.
Well, that's in the social fabric, the social dynamic.
Yes, in the social biotensegrity.
Okay. That would be, I think, all of our hopes, no matter where we are. Joanne, do you want to join in for this, or John? You're muted, John.
You're muted, John. Is John there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just trying to make sure that I didn't commit any mortal sins and start talking when I shouldn't talk. That was wonderful. I want to hear David talk more about that. Really, I do. I mean, we don't have David on these episodes very often, so you don't need to hear me, but that's fantastic, David, what you said. And, that resonates very, very, well with me. And again, it's a reflection of biotensegrity and biotensegrity impacting on our lives. It's not just about some structural model or some architectural explanation about the cellular. That's true. That's a big part of it. But biotensegrity, and I don't know what Graham was getting at exactly when he said he didn't agree with what I was saying, but biotensegrity explains everything. Everything.
Joanne, I'm tempted to have Graham come in.
I think that's a good idea. Let's mix it up, guys.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on that, but I'm not sure this is a place for discussion, because we're talking really about fascia.
Good point.
I can go on more. I think what John is saying, I can understand what you're saying, of how your view of biotensegrity applies to the whole of life. And indeed, we can have tension and compression, interaction between people that bring us together, that keep things apart. But that's a long way removed from what biotensegrity is about. Biotensegrity is about biology, not social interaction.
Biotensegrity is about living organisms, and we cry, and we love, and we hate, and we make mistakes. And if you don't,
I separate this, make a distinction.
But you shouldn't, Graham. You shouldn't, and that's what I would say. Biotensegrity is about living, and bio is living. It's living tensegrity.
Now, been trying to view biotensegrity about the biology, and what you're talking about is tensegrity, which is different. Tensegrity is not the same.
If I can jump in here, I think what we're looking at, and this would make a fabulous kind of roundtable here. John, you're talking about tensegrity as a cosmological construct from the micro to the macro, and Graham, we're talking about within a unique biological organism, right, or the components of that biological organism. Yes. And those are two very big things in and of themselves. And you're saying you're not 100% that they're compatible with each other, and this might not be the best forum for it.
They are compatible with each other, but there's very important distinction between them. Otherwise, people don't study biotensegrity, the biology, because they're all off on interaction between people, which is another thing altogether, related, but it takes away from all the work we've done on looking at how the body internally works.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this out real quick, John. You can steal it. Maybe you should use the term cosmotensegrity.
And well,
but I think
it's yours. It's yours. I'm not going to use it.
It comes back to us wanting to separate and dissect and cut things into parts again. And
that's the way we learn, that we have to separate things out in order to make sense out of things, and then we put them all together. But
absolutely, as a clinical analyst, I was encouraged to do that, and what I'm trying to do is not do that, because everything is connected. And
because we lose it when we separate,
if you truly understand that everything is connected, then you'll understand that I'm correct. And
there we go.
Oh, we are on one to the enlightened
Can I
wisdom
yield back
of John.
to you, Susan?
Yeah, so I'm going to just say we're going to pause a little for station identification. And I want to just thank Carol and Joanne and John and David for joining us today. It's clear when we have these discussions, just how much new territory is ahead to be wandered through and enjoyed and hustled over. And I love the richness of the discussion, and we're getting through the chat that a lot of people are just loving it as well. So we love we embrace the controversy. So I'm gonna let
There's some interesting questions down there.
Say again, David, sorry.
There's some real interesting questions popping up in the last few minutes, I gotta tell you.
Right? Thank goodness we record these things. And I go back over them every weekend. I spent going through them. It's amazing to me. So I'm gonna say, maybe Graham, are you up for the station identification part? And then we're gonna be, after that, we're gonna be doing, in terms of the sponsors, Graham, just going over that again.
Yes,
And then,
sponsors.
yes, thanks. And then we have a number of questions in the chat. If you are putting questions in the chat, make sure they go to everyone and not to someone specifically, because we've got a number of people who are trying to keep track of the questions, because it gets very confusing. So thank you in advance. Over to you, Graham.
Well, our Biotensegrity Tea Party events are a production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive in Washington, D.C., whose mission in part is educational. Download our free BX 101 self-study guide to beginning biotensegrity. Join our email list and learn more at biotensegrityarchive.org. Now, this presentation is on the Zoom channel, which if you wanted to join, then join the Biotensegrity Archive, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get a notification each week to be part of the Zoom where you can participate live in a discussion. We're also live on the YouTube Biotensegrity Archive channel, which you can watch now live, but also forevermore. So keep going back to it, going through them. There are hundreds, in fact, thousands of views now over the last few weeks. And once again, we want to give a huge thanks to our sponsors, our publisher, Handspring Publishing in East Lothian, Scotland, who have offered everyone on the Biotensegrity Archive email list generous coupon for purchasing their books. So thank you, Handspring. Thanks also to Fernando Tejero and ArteFact Pro in Madrid for sponsoring us today and supplying our archive newsletter readers with a coupon code to get a very nice discount for your wonderful models. We also want to thank Embodied Biotensegrity and to Chris Clancy for our technical support. And a special thank you to our ever flexible and supportive technical director, Mariana Bretto, and to the multi-talented archive newsletter editor and director of, I can't remember what the actual term we have for it, Rachel Tudor, for volunteering to help us out as well. So if you want to join us on Zoom for future Biotensegrity Tea Party events, or get the coupon code from our sponsors and other tasty treats, join the Biotensegrity Archive email list at biotensegrityarchive.org. And with that, I hand it over to you, Susan.
All right. I want to just mention, people have been apparently making comments about my strange dark glasses. I'm just going to show you all. These are just pinhole glasses. They just have holes in them because I don't use prescription. I don't use magnification. This is the camera principle. So if you're interested, you can look up pinhole glasses. These are I can see better with these glasses. I don't mean to be evasive.
We just thought you were trying to outcool everybody else. That's all.
I don't need to, David. I'm already cool. Thank you. But I don't have that cool radio voice. So we have a question, Carol, that people would like a little bit of an expansion on the liquid crystalline structure and its relationship to fascia and energy storage in the body.
Okay, who wants to take that one? The liquid crystalline structure.
All right.
Pollock has
I'll,
informed us about this with the H2O becoming H3O2 as it enters the body. Everything becomes colloidal, which is crystalline in nature, that responds specifically to pressure and tension and sending out electrons and acting like crystals. And part of that dynamic is the crystalline part of fascia, hyaluronic acid, all the way through to the bound water that can be found both in the capillaries and in the fascia itself. David, what were you going to say?
I kind of lost my thread because you did that really interesting overlay of that idea. Many substances are by their nature a liquid crystalline in structure, meaning that they have a very regular molecular structure. The analogy that's always used is the screen that you're watching right now is a liquid crystal display, which means they can have a current pass through them and they can potentially store and reproduce information. So there's a lot of speculation that because fascia or collagen has this nature that it could act as a repository for stored information. This has not been proven. It's interesting speculation. It's also interesting that in Israel, they were making computer components and microchips out of organic structures, such as bone and milk solids, because they're trying to find a way to make computers that, if we need to turn them over because of changes in technology, are more friendly to the environment. I have contacted them. They've never tried to use collagen as a medium for these things. And that's as far as I've been able to take that concept, because I think that's the question underlying it is like, okay, what if collagen is this liquid crystal? What does that mean? Is that information that we can actually use to make our therapies more effective?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know yet.
That's because we don't know anything about chocolate.
Well, I'm all for chocolate therapy, Joanne, so go for it.
And Steve just made a comment about how the first thing with biology is the second law of thermodynamics it's going to be a conservation of energy kind of thing. And then that's what's underlying everything that we do with biotensegrity. And biotensegrity is second to that. So I don't know if Carol or Graham has something to add to that or wants to ask anybody in particular on the panel about that.
Would someone like to comment on Steve's comments? Second law. Graham, I think you spoke about this actually in your talk a couple of weeks ago, or at the BFS. You're muted, Graham.
Graham
you don't want to talk. Okay. Joanne? John?
I think Graham can't unmute himself and somebody needs to make him a co-host.
Thank you,
Okay,
Marianne.
there he is. All right.
I must confess, while you asked that question, I was searching through the chat to
thinking about something else.
Yes, so you have to fill me in on that.
Well, Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, Steve, why don't you jump in? That's great, Carol.
Well, I just, there's fundamental laws and then there's secondary laws to that. And the laws of thermodynamics is dominant and much more fundamental than anything else. And it has to do with, the second law has to do with chaos. Essentially, everything goes to disorganization, but it doesn't in biotensegrity. In life, it does exactly opposite. It is the driving force of chaos actually creates biotensegrity because it creates the easiest way to do things. So out of disorganization comes the organization of biotensegrity. But the driving force behind it is the second law of thermodynamics.
And that second law of thermodynamics is?
The second law of thermodynamics is everything turns to crap. Essentially, that everything disintegrates, it gets less, that it gets, and it can't go the other way. Everything deteriorates and it can't go the other way. Well, biology works the other way. What happens is you get the simplest, least energy. It out of the law of thermodynamics, you get the least energy concept. Everything is always biologic forces are always going to be least energy, always. So, so that all you have to do is say which is more or less energetic than the other one, and you'll know what your choice is. So that I will tell you that our whole concept of muscles is wrong because it's based on the muscles creating force, and actually they don't. What we have to understand is that the body uses something else if it can. So it builds springs to take the energy from the ground reaction force and puts it back into the body, because that's the most energy efficient way of doing it. So all you have to do is say, what is the most energy way of doing it? And that's the way it's going to work. But
I'm also going to say, Steve, thank you, just because I'm going through the chat as well. And in the Biotensegrity book club that Chris Clancy runs the other day, we were talking about concepts of degeneracy in terms of viewing the body as a system. And Lisa Babiuk has a question about sort of relating that to the conservation of energy.
Is there a question that you would like to follow up with that, Susan? Do you want Lisa to follow up with a question?
Lisa, do you want to unmute yourself?
Mariana? She's looking for Lisa.
While people are doing that, can I just encourage everybody, if you wish, to look up Buckminster Fuller and look up the term that Buckminster Fuller used, which was ephemeralization. That's an
ephemeralization.
Yeah, I'm not great at spelling. EPHEMERMALIS for Europe, Z for North Americas.
I'll put it in the chat.
I think I'm terrible at spelling because I'm dyslexic. But ephemeralization is really about the process of getting more and more for less and less. And it was a central theme in Buckminster Fuller's work, an absolute central theme. Yeah. So again, it's one of these topics that we would not be able to do justice to in the time slot we have now. But I think if people want to look up Buckminster Fuller and ephemeralization, you'll get a better sense. In fact, it's how we've moved towards building bridges and other structures in the modern era using tensegrity principles and getting more and more for less and less.
So and it's reminding me too of how often that the biomechanics courses that are taught, particularly in physical therapy school, because that's what I'm most knowledgeable about, is all based on solid state physics. And there's nothing solid inside our bodies. And this is just another example of how we've just distorted our understanding of these basic laws, taken them directly from Newton and tried to apply them and make them work inside this thing that we've cut open and separated into parts and tried to analyze through hinge joints and so forth. But the fact is that now we have a whole body of knowledge that's building, and there's still a kind of a closed off resistance to opening up our understanding of how this might make it better for us. I think so often we resist change because it becomes, we think, energy efficient to continue on with the same old beliefs, and they're just not working anymore. The things that we have to do to fit square pegs into round holes to make it work are just phenomenal. And this kind of, once you start this trek toward biotensegrity and fascia and start reading and being connected at that level, things start building and building and building. But it all comes down to, and I remember that first big meeting I went to in 2016, Steve Levin, and he said, nothing is solid in the body, not a thing. And I thought, well, what about the bones? And of course, then I was disabused of that theory very, very quickly. And since then, everything now has opened up to me in a way that makes it so much more poetic, so much more beautiful, so much artistic expression of the creator in all of this. It's anyway, I'll stop. I'm not a part of it.
Go back to Dr. Levin's papers in the 70s. Go back to those papers.
Yeah, and John Barnes. John Barnes and Steve Levin were working together. And that's where I got my start. And those principles are so profound, and they haven't changed. They've just gotten more and more informed with the science.
But the BiotensegriTea.com website has wonderful papers, and that this was discussed in those papers, that if you actually use the formulae that they use in classic biomechanics, the quantities of energy, the forces that are involved just don't make sense. That
they blow us up.
Integrity construct would never use such principles, so it just doesn't make sense. It contradicts the laws of thermodynamics. So I can look at those papers. They're there for people to see on, I think it's BiotensegriTea.com, and also on the archive. And these are from the early 70s and so on. This is not something new.
Not new,
it's already been hypothesized, and good arguments put forward. In terms of demonstrating to people how this idea is a ridiculous idea. You can't generate those forces. It's an impossibility. There must be a different. Well, I beg your pardon. We are doing the actions and we're able to do it, but there has to be a different explanation concerning how we're able to do it, and it's not based upon levers and so on.
Right.
Carol, it's where I adopted the word bioemotional, which is not an official word. I mean, it doesn't exist in the English dictionary, but it makes so much sense, because for me, bioemotional includes the emotion. But the aspect of this, a lot of people here asking about thixotropy, how do I pronounce it?
Thixotropy.
Well, that's American. It's anyway. The thing about, let me just talk about chocolate for a minute and just say something. One of the things you said, Carol, square peg round hole. I think a lot of people, we've grown up, we've evolved with a linear explanation. We've got a nice intellectual, we want an intellectual linear explanation. And we are rounded. We exist in I don't mean round as in a perfect sphere. I mean round as in a container that has roundedness. And the tensegrity icosahedron, in fact, explains roundedness. Actually, I can't get to that in 2 sentences. But what biotensegrity does is it upgrades our explanations to things that facilitate and incorporate and express us moving through space as round things. So this wall next to me is a flat, square, linear thing, if you like. It's obviously 3-dimensional, but it's a rigid architecture. And this is a morphologically changeable one that I can animate myself. And what is so difficult to get our heads around, I think, and why it's hard to hold on to this, is that there's so many elements involved. And when you're working with chocolate, to use it as a very simple analogy, but I mean, I could talk about this for about a week, so I'm going to try and condense it. But when you're working with chocolate, you start off with something that appears solid. You start off with a block or buttons. Well, you actually start off with beans that you have to conch, but that's going too far. But just for the sake of this analogy, you then melt that, but that won't behave in the predictable ways that you need it to behave. You then have to temper it. In other words, you have to heat it and cool it. And depending on the age, the type of bean, the color of the bean, where the bean came from, is the particular temperatures that particular chocolate has to be tempered at, and the period over which it is tempered. And then you have to mold it or enrobe it, and then you have to cool it, but you must make sure that the rate of change from heating to cooling is absolutely specific to that thing. And basically what happens is you start learning about, you don't even know you're doing it, because as a craftsman, artisan, chocolatier, you just up to your elbows in it, you just get on with it. But what you're actually doing is managing these exquisitely fine balances of the behaviors of a liquid crystal.
Yeah.
And where I think Graham and John's comments earlier that what we have to think about is that biotensegrity incorporates not 2 opposites, but 3 states: tension, compression, and their combination as a volume. And this is where we get in a pickle when we start saying it's a duality, or you yourself, you stand accused, my darling, who I love and adore, you know I do. We all do this. We talk about the protons and the electrons in an atom. There's protons, electrons, and neutrons. There's only one atom that doesn't have a neutron, and that's significant. It's atom number 1. And that's got, in mystery school work, that's got a whole significance. You know, the ancients knew this shit long before we've ever tried to chase up behind. I mean, it makes me laugh. But anyway, and I include myself in that. But what I'm saying about chocolate is that I realized, looking back on 20 years as a chocolatier, and I recently went back to my son's father still has a development kitchen. I was in there last year. Oh my God, I was in heaven. And you have to get the balance of so many different elements of timing, temperature, pace, speed, rate of change. You have to get them right so that when you buy that pistachio cream that you adore, or that hazelnut glacé, or whatever the hell it is that's your favorite chocolate, so that it acts as if it's solid so that you can eat it temporarily, it behaves as you want it to. Because if you don't get those emergent properties right, it will just, the minute you put it in your hand, it will melt. It will have no solidity. It's a completely time-based thing. And what I think we're dealing with here are emergent properties of changing morphologies. And it is very hard to get your head around scientifically. Steve's presentation had maths, physics, chemistry, biology, geometry, soft matter physics, hard matter physics, liquid crystals. I mean, for God's sake, you could probably write a university curriculum
in 12 minutes.
Yeah. So if we can just bring it back to a simpler thing, because I think you're right, Joanne, it's like deep stuff. And whenever we get into soft matter, so the question Heidi Himmelberg is asking is, do the tissues get thicker as they change shape rather than get thinner? And I'm going to jump in, and Graham, Steve, anyone who wants to can correct me. The tissues do what they need to do. We study soft matter, inert soft matter, as a way of understanding and thixotropy or thixotropy and rheopacticity and electrorheopacticity. These are all just, I saw an article the other day on soft matter. There may be over 500 states, hundreds of states. The body does what it needs to do to get the job done and can recruit what it needs to get the job done. So it's not one thing. It's many different possibilities. And over time, through our developmental continuum as people, but also the evolutionary continuum, a host of innumerable organisms over time, biology's figured out what are the optimal combinations of things. Would you say? Why are David and John muted? I have a technical question.
I'm trying to make sure that I stop from talking.
Oh, yeah, you can mute yourself. That's fine.
Yeah, but
it's polite. It's polite.
Yeah,
yes.
I want to hear other people speaking. I think it's, and it was a brilliant presentation. I loved it. Joanne was absolutely correct. You could do a PhD on it. And it's just amazing. Stephen does this every single time he presents. He just keeps coming up with the goods.
Right.
Well, thank you, everybody. But what I think the most important thing I had in there were a couple of new concepts of how the mechanics of how it happens. That there are, those shifting things that I showed you with the Voronoi changing in shape and things like that are driven by the second law of biomechanics, of thermodynamics, so that the structural changes in the body are related to these physical laws. And this is the mechanics of how it's done.
Well, the piece that I also got was your mention, and you and I kind of sparred back and forth in 2016 about this, and and is that the subtle energy piece, and that's the concept of subatomic particles being able to be transmitted and communicating to every cell. And yes, the cable nerves are all a part of this, but Jaap has really expanded. Some of you heard my presentation at the British Fascia Symposium, and Jaap wrote me a 5-page single-spaced letter about what I was missing. And it really is just expanding my mind. I have to read a half a page at a time. But I woke up this morning thinking about that too, and that is that the eye may be the sense organ that gives us the access to sight, but the experience of seeing is very different from what that organ does for us. The experience, and we've been dancing around this a little bit today, this whole idea of that John was talking about the experience of how this translates into social dynamics and cultural dynamics and basic belief systems. Those are the experience that this biology allows us to have as the framework upon which we create our lives. And that reminds me of one of my wonderful questions for Joanne. And that was, is that, where did you say that? Your wonderful Winston Churchill quote before chapter 3 on the science of body architecture. You said, we shape our dwellings, and afterwards our dwellings shape us, Winston Churchill. And couldn't it also be said that our stories shape our dwellings, and afterwards our dwellings shape us? And again, it's a
to what Graham and John were just saying, that I personally, unless you're reducing biology to the physical function of flesh and bone, which I don't, as you know, spiritual sciences is what I'm about, and my focus is very much on how we animate this form, and I don't think we can reduce it to the purely physical domain. I just don't. And I also get a bit antsy about Newton being written off as Newtonian physics, as if they can be written off, because his first law is that to every known force in the universe, there is an equal and opposite force. And that is that balance, that quiescence.
It's the interpretation of it really that should be
balance said. That all the time. And I think what you're saying is that we are in a relationship constantly with this physical form. Okay, here's the thing. I remember having this conversation with Tom Myers in Tottenham Court Road in 1999. We were crossing Tottenham Court Road together. And he said to me, what do you think fascia is, Jo? And I said, the page upon which our body story is written in the fabric of our form. And he said, what, you mean it's our story? I said, no, it's the page the story's written on. It's different. It's not the words. That's our narrative. It's the page, it's the physiological page, but that shapes us and then we shape it. So the question then is, can we change that shape with how we think and how we feel? And a lot of people in the chat have talked about how this is shifting us from a mechanical or biomechanical explanations of function, as if we are 2-bar levers and everything is linear and 2D. It's allowing us to expand our awareness into what moves us, as well as how we are moved, how the dwelling shapes us and we shape the dwelling. Now, you can take that on a personal level. You know, I lost my father last year, and I could be shaped by that grief. I could fold into it. I could have held myself down. I could have wept for a year and be slowly emerging and physiologically, you know, shaped by it. And I am shaped by it. And as it happens, my father moved me and trained me to be a loving, dynamic, mad storyteller who he adored, who adored him. He was the finest storyteller in the world. And for him, my stories were never long enough. So, you know, that is, I feel his absence. But I am shaped by him. My God, I was born to him. And I always remember he said to me, when you were born, I was 4 pounds, I was premature. He said, I used to sit you on my hand. I'm going to cry. And I used to put my middle finger up, and your whole spine was held up by my middle finger. Now, my father would have breathed for me when I had asthma. He would have breathed for me if he could have. Has that shaped me? Excuse my French, too effing right it has. It's shaped my soul. It's shaped my humor. It's shaped my way, and we are shaped by our world, and we have the power to shape it. And our shape fabric is fascia. And the forces that we explain moving through that are our biotentegral integration, because everything's connected to everything else and affects everything else. So damn right, of course.
But the experiencing of that is minimized when we start to try to change, to try to describe that through the anatomical structure of cable nerves and proprioceptors and free nerve endings.
If we forget,
well, why is it necessarily minimized? Why is it necessarily minimized, Carol? I mean, you know, it's like that's part of the understanding of the wonder of the inner universe. I don't think our outer universe is minimized by understanding the formations of stars and galaxies. Neither do I think that our inner universe is minimized by understanding the mechanisms that make things happen. It still doesn't explain the prime driver behind them, but to me, it adds to the wonder. Yes, we can get lost in thinking that it's all a mechanical operation. And part of that, I believe, is just cultural and born out of the Industrial Revolution. But if we just change the way we talk about it, we can reshape the conversation.
Wow.
If we quit saying the body is a machine, could we stop saying that now? Please.
Yes.
It's not a machine. That's just a very simple example.
Well, that relates to what you said a long time ago, David, in this conversation, and that is the way things change, the way things stay the same, and that is we have to shape the conversation socially as well. Mm-hmm. But the idea of let's not get lost in this concept of layers and spaces. Let's start using a new language. Let's start talking about that. There are no spaces. There are no layers.
But it also depends on who you're talking. It depends on who you're talking to as well. So I'm trying to create change in the medical environment and in that culture. So being able to speak that language allows me to shape the conversation I'm having with people who are more in that world and less in my world. So it's good to know the dialect. You know, you get a lot further in Germany if you can say please, thank you, in American Dummkopf, than if you knock on the window of the taxi and say English. I've seen that happen.
But you know what needs to happen from my perspective is that, yes, let's talk about the micro and let's talk about the macro, but in all of the conversations, let's not lose sight of connectivity and wholeness. That's the secret. And then we can have both conversations, because the truth of the matter is, we are very interested in looking at the minutiae, the finer detail. And if we didn't look at that, then we wouldn't have made certain advances in medicine. And, you know, medicine has gotten some things wrong, but it's also gotten some just amazing things right. I'm in awe of some of my colleagues and what they do, you know, and it's just fantastic. So we need both ends of the spectrum. But what I would encourage people to do is please don't lose sight of the idea of connectedness. And please also listen to these words. You might think it's simple. Oh yeah, I got that, John. That's great. No, you haven't got it. I haven't got it yet. You haven't got it. I loved listening to what David has just said and what you, my gosh, there's so much wisdom in what our last two speakers just said. That was just fantastic. And if you just came on board and listened to the last few minutes, boy, have you got value for money, which of course you don't pay for this, which means that you're getting twice as much value.
On you and your bloody Irish.
Infinite value. It's infinite value. This is fantastic. I love these tea parties. They're amazing.
We are getting close to 2 hours, so I want to make sure that if people have questions, you know, they get them in, but it looks like people are pretty happy with the discussion that's been going on there. Anyway, Gilmer says the only drawback to coming out of confinement and going back to work is not being able to get to these sessions on time.
Well, if I can just say that's why they're recorded. So.
Yeah. And Graham reminds us that the archive is also accepting donations at your will. So we are trying to promote the work of the archive through this. So yeah, it's free. But of course, a lot of us are putting in a lot of volunteer time to bring it to you. So if you do want to say thank you, that would be a way to do it. And I'm going to also mention, and I don't know if Chris is still around, but
Yeah, what happened to Chris?
well, we've all got lots of things going on, and there's the whole.
I've been doing crazy tech duty,
Yes,
Carol. I've hardly heard a word. I have to go back and listen.
There's
Oh,
been a lot of behind the scenes tech so that you could relax and just be the eye candy, Carol.
I've never been called that before.
Well, you've been, but we want to make sure everybody knows that we're planning events in Montreal for 2021, in concert sort of with the Fascia Research Congress, and we have a questionnaire we want people to fill out. Maybe Chris can put that in the chat.
Yes, I'll do that. First, I'm putting the link to the donate to the archive button, and then I'll find the link for the questionnaire. Do we have a deadline for that questionnaire, Susan?
I think it was the end of last month.
I know, but I took that off I took that off the survey, but shall we decide on a new deadline?
Yeah, I mean, if you're seeing this and you can get it to us within the week, that would be great, because we're starting to, you know, we've got the scientific advisory board together, and we've got the arts and applications panel coming together as well. So we do want your feedback and how to make it a sort of the push of the scientific angle and the pull of the arts and applications to pull everything together, and how do we get these married up in a way that is reflective of our models that we use.
I want to address, if I could just real quickly here, something I
Yes,
see in the
please.
chat room. Rebecca Case Upton. Hello, Rebecca Case Upton. She says, I've always been amazed that biology, chemistry, and physics are taught and learned so separately in school. And, you know, it could be really confusing if we taught them all at once, because it really is that complicated. I think what's missing is, and again, is befits the name of my department, integrative medicine. We don't then take, once we've studied these things separately, and have a class that says, okay, here's all these things all integrate and work together. So we grow up with this idea of these separate systems, and we don't think about the unity of the systems. But I just want to be sure that there is value to studying these systems separately on a conceptual level, as long as we always find a way to hook them all back together again. So that's my 2 cents on that, Rebecca. Thanks for that comment.
Which is exactly my point, and David has just reflected it again, that there's absolutely no harm in studying these individual parts, the small parts, as long as then you have an opportunity. That's well said. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yes, even Mozart had to do his scales every day.
We have to find compassion, and we have to find a lot of compassion and this is what happened in studying the history so much for me, was that we get compassion for what people had at the time, the information they had at the time, they put together the best possible things they had at the time. And it was extraordinary when you think of the technology that we have today, compared to when you just Leonardo da Vinci's drawings of 4-dimensional structures of geometry. I have commissioned somebody to draw some of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings, generate them as computer graphics, and they can't be done. Computer can't do them. He saw multidimensionally. His mind was extraordinary. And I think we have to have a lot of compassion for people that they cut things up, and what we need to do is remember that they weren't bad or wrong or stupid. They did amazing things at the time in the context of their time, which is what we're doing, and that we can give that back a bit wiser if we remember that after we've cut everything up in little pieces and laid it out and labeled it and named and blamed it, that we then reclaim it back to the whole. And that is what I think biotensegrity is an invitation to do, is to reclaim it back into wholeness, not rewrite the books, not start again. As Steve says, this is not new, but let's make it new, that we're all connected and that we're all whole and that we are one collective, connected collective.
Right. Good. Well, thank you everyone for allowing me the opportunity to host. I've enjoyed it immensely. Obviously, I knew it would be rich because I knew the richness of these people and the group, the collective, and it was richer than I even anticipated. So thank you, Susan, Graham, and Chris. Thank you, Steve, for starting us out again with that magnificent video. And do we have any information about next week, Susan?
Next week is going to be really interesting to me. Steve and Dennis Bartram have been friends for a long time. Dennis Bartram teaches Amatsu, and we have something called ABC, Amatsu, the Amatsu Biotensegrity correlation. Everyone who studies Amatsu studies biotensegrity as well, and within that. And Jane Langston is a Handspring author who has a book, The Concise Book of Muscle Testing, and she's an Amatsu practitioner. And so she's going to be on, and Sean Beakey, who's also an Amatsu teacher and practitioner in Ireland, is going to be, they're going to kind of co-interview each other. So it's really going to be some interesting new territory, and we're looking forward to it.
Good, great.
And thank you to everyone. Thank you, David, John, Joanne, Carol, you guys gave up your time for us today and were so generous with your hearts, with your words, with your thoughts. It's just so wonderful. Steve, it's always, of course, great to have you. Thanks to Rachel Tudor and Mariana Barreto again, because when things go crazy with tech, as they did today, they're right there at our backs. They've got our backs, and we really appreciate it. And thanks to my co-hosts, Graham and Chris. And we will be back next week, and with any luck, we'll get all of today's bumps in the road, or wrinkles in the fabric ironed out. We're still sequestered here. And I'm going to show you what my jelly came in today. It came wrapped in this cardboard.
Yeah.
Look at that, protecting the glass. And I just thought, like Joanne Avison, I've got all my toys,
Bags of that stuff. I have bags of that stuff. It's fantastic.
Exactly.
I just love the idea that one piece of paper can be cut in the pattern, actually, that the triple helix of the fascia forms as collagen. It's the same pattern, and it's there. And it's just, I love it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
you for inviting me. See you next time.
Cheers.
See you next time, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
See you, Joe.
Cheers.